Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Western capitals and their pliant corporate media continue to maintain the West is not at war with Russia. However, the fact is NATO is a co-belligerent, supplying financial support, arms, and diplomatic cover for Kiev. When the West claims otherwise, it means it's losing. Cross-talking the West's war on Russia, I'm joined by my guest, Joe Laurie in Sydney. He's the editor-in-chief of consortiumnews.com. In Tulsa, we have Jeremy Kuzmatov. He is managing editor of Covert Action magazine. And in Los Angeles, we have Pi Ian. He is a strategic planning consultant, a private equity advisor, and an independent economic analyst. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to Joe first in Sydney here. Over the last week or so, 10 days or so, we've had peace proposals coming out. There's leaks about a possibility of the UK, France, and Germany having a proposal. From what I've read, it's very Ukraine-centric, not security-centric. And the Chinese came out with a 12-point proposal, which has been widely dismissed in the West here. So what is the strategic goal here? I mean, if it's all focused on Ukraine, and if you look at the Chinese proposal, it's heavy on security. And I think that's the biggest difference between the two. Go ahead, Joe.
I think when and if Bakhmut falls to Russia is going to be a major turning point, and a decision will have to be made. It'll be a big humiliation for the United States, for Europe, and for Zelensky. What do they do then? Do they listen to the realists, such as Macron and Schultz, as they are, and Peter Pavel of the Czech Republic, or to the neocons in the U.S., Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan, and in Europe, Baerbock, and von der Leyen, etc., Maloney? What are they going to do right then? We don't really know where Biden stands on all that, which is, of course, key. Do they decide that there has to be a deal? And with Russia at that point, way ahead. And don't forget, Schultz and Macron told Zelensky at a dinner in Paris at the beginning of February that there's no way Ukraine can win the war. And they had some cockamamie idea of to launch an offensive, gain some more territory to push Russia to the peace table. Well, at this point, Russia could demand all the terms that they want, if indeed, after Bakhmut, they decide that they're going to have to end this war. And that would mean, for Russia's sake, they would want, obviously, recognition of Crimea and the 4 republics that voted to join Russia. They would want the demilitarization of Ukraine, the disbandment of Nazi militias, and the NATO and U.S. treaties that they proposed at the beginning in December 2021. That had that been taken seriously, this phase of the war would not have happened. So will they be able to swallow a loss and give those terms to Russia? This is the big question. Or will they escalate?
Well, Jeremy, Joe's got it spot on here, because recently we had Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, say that we're at war with Russia. And then Samantha Power on a CNN town hall said, the West is at war with Russia. I mean, and they keep saying they're not a co-belligerent here. That's why, Jeremy, the Russians have a hard time trusting anyone. I mean, they say one thing out of one side of their mouth, and they do something else on the other side here. I mean, there's no interlocutor here, even, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, and even with the Minsk frame, there was the Minsk peace framework before, but we have the admission of Angela Merkel and before that Poroshenko that was just, designed to bide time. For the war that really they were planning on Russia. And we have, you can go back in history. My book, The Russians Are Coming Again, showed a 100-year pattern of deceit by the West and the United States, especially going back to the Russian Revolution, where Lenin was open to peace agreements, and they sabotaged that and they invaded Russia. You can look at the issue of NATO expansion and the false promise. So absolutely, yeah, Russia has no reason to trust the United States and to trust any agreement. And that's why I would think they would be, I think they would, if their terms are granted, like Joe was saying, obviously they would accept it, but they know the track record, and they know that they're out to get them. So they have to be very cautious and guarded about anything they do.
Well, of course, to my guests and to my audience here, the terms and conditions of negotiation have already been set out. And Joe was right. It was on December 17, 2021. It's there. It was made public, and it was dismissed by Western capitals, particularly Washington. Pine, let me go to you in Los Angeles. The Chinese proposal fascinated me. I mean, it wasn't everything that Russia wanted. As a matter of fact, the Russians said, we're studying it very carefully. I mean, that was about as tepid as response as you could get here. But, the West doesn't want the Chinese to be a power broker. I mean, it's a very neo-colonial in their mind, in their thinking, is that how could the Chinese be a broker? How could China come out on the world stage and mediate between the West and Russia? I mean, it's a very backward-looking approach, in my opinion. I mean, it's a major country, second largest economy, maybe the biggest in the world. It's got a lot of clout, and it should be listened to. Go ahead and Pi in Los Angeles.
Everything is indirect, especially with the stakes high through global diplomacy. The Chinese know if Russia somehow, I doubt it, but if they were to fall, then the Chinese would be next,
right,
for what the West plans. In turn, thus the Chinese are soft signaling, indirectly signaling that an alliance, not just tight trading partner and whatnot, but of a potential military-backed becoming stronger between these two Eurasian poles. For now, NATO doesn't want a direct war and can't afford it anyway, either economically or militarily. NATO's intention, I sense, is to simply try and reprise its experiences of the late 70s through the early 90s, where it exhausted the Soviet Union using Afghanistan's mujahideen, tactically lowered oil and gas prices, and heavy global PR, enforcing Gorbachev's ultimate sellout. NATO today seeks to bleed Russia dry of resources, money, manpower, armaments, patience, and goodwill with her neighbors and her allies, to isolate and alienate Russia as much as possible through the onslaught of economic and financial sanctions, military attrition, propaganda, and humiliation, and anything else that it takes to arrest this clear macroeconomic
none of those
momentum.
things are in play. All the things you just listed are not in play whatsoever. Russia's economy is growing. The West is growing into recession. I mean, they're in the black here, not the red. Joe, one of the things that I find very frustrating is the terms and conditions of the narrative, because somehow to give a reprieve to Ukraine, to get as much territory, and then sit down and talk. Well, first of all, the Russians have no interested in doing that whatsoever. The problem here is that the West is looking for some kind of strategic defeat of Russia. That's not going to happen. But the way out of this is to talk about the indivisibility of security, where everybody gets security. The West refuses to talk that way, refuses, flat out. Joe.
Yeah, we're getting back to square one, back to what Russia's been talking about for years. I mean, ever since Yeltsin himself was also opposed to NATO expansion, and they wanted Russia's security interests to be taken into account. Putin asked Clinton to join NATO, and they've continuously held a handout to the West, and it's been clear what the West wants, that they want to get back to the years in the 90s when they ran many things in Russia, and they asset stripped the formerly state-owned industries and enriched themselves on Wall Street, and a new class of oligarchs, and the enormous resources that Russia has is certainly what the West has been eyeing here. But they have to face the reality now, and again, it comes down to the realists versus the neocons. Will they begin to understand that their entire plan here, their information war, their economic war, and their proxy war are failing? Of course, the information war is working only in the West, in European and American and United States. People believe the story, but everywhere else in the world, it is not believed. There's a whole new economic system that's being grown up. Economic, monetary, financial, and commercial system is the U.S. and Europe are going to have to face the fact that they're on the outside looking in. They are isolated themselves. This is not China of 30, 40 years ago, or Russia of the Yeltsin days. It's not India of 40 years years ago, or Africa as well. So the entire world has changed, and we're seeing maybe the end of really the end of the last gasps of colonialism, that the African nations and Latin America, they are going either being neutral formally, but certainly not putting sanctions on Russia. They have seen this as an opportunity now for a new world to be created in front of our eyes. And the United States is going to have to swallow it and realize that they're no longer the power that they think that they are. And they have to do that quickly, because we're at an enormously dramatic point in human history, and because of nuclear weapons, maybe the most dramatic point in history, where they cannot escalate this. They've got to realize they bit off more than they can chew here and get to a new arrangement and become another member of the international community.
Yeah, well, Jeremy, that's something that is going to be almost impossible for the West to accept, because it is being dethroned as the hegemon of the world. And that is something that the West can't begin to comprehend. It's in their interest to do it, but they can't comprehend it. Jeremy.
I would tend to agree, yeah, and that's why we are at a very dangerous moment in history, because they can't accept this reality that Joe's describing, and so they're provoking conflicts now with Russia and China at the same time, and these, threaten to escalate into world wars or nuclear wars, and yeah, they'll, it's like somebody's, dog backed into a corner, and I don't know, he's willing to almost engage in suicidal behavior is what we kind of see. He can't accept it. So, yeah, it's just a very...
Well, I mean, an example of that, let me go to Pi before we go to the break here, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. That was an act of desperation, okay? They have no means, they have no arguments, okay? They're not reasonable people, and they will do the most unreasonable, illegal, and that's actually a terrorist attack, okay? Pi, before we go to the break, go ahead.
I mean, it's NATO's MO, or certainly that of the neocons and neoliberals. Same Straussian difference, by the way. I mean, to deceive through tactical and seemingly random acts of sabotage while chewing up the trust of so-called allies. The higher the stakes, the shorter the timeframes to act under, the more desperately the cover of plausible deniability must be sacrificed for the sake of doubling down on the optics of intimidation, because it's better to be feared than loved, as the late Donald Rumsfeld said, paraphrasing Machiavelli. Hence, Seymour Hersh was actually tasked by the establishment in writing a Substack piece on Nord Stream as means of revealing the method in occult speak, controlled opposition as indirect confirmation of who and what did Nord Stream, in order to signal that they're capable and willing to commit industrial terrorism or acts of war yet again. It's mind-boggling how the Ukrainian masses do not see how they're being used up like a moist
It's mind-boggling to me the German chancellor would sit next to Biden and not say a word about it. That's mind-blowing to me. Gentlemen, I have to go to a break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the West's war on Russia. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the West's war on Russia. Okay, let's go back to Joe in Sydney. Joe Biden, for whatever, if you agree or disagree with him, like or dislike him, he's done something unprecedented in post-World War II history. He's allowing or targeting, pivoting to a position where there is a great power conflict. Every single president since FDR, Harry Truman, don't go to toe with the Soviet Union. Don't go toe to toe with Russia. Joe Biden is doing that. And the reason why the United States never did it and the Soviet Union never did it, because it becomes existential. You could actually lose, and probably both would lose. This is unique, and this is what makes it so very dangerous. If you look at through history, great powers avoid wars with other great powers. Go ahead, Joe.
Obviously, and yes, it's very shocking how Biden has come through with this policy that we all feared Hillary Clinton would have done had she won in 2016. And here we have, she wanted a no-fly zone over Syria, and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time testified that would bring war with Russia. So even back then, the idea of a war with Russia was just a non-starter. It was a taboo. That has ended. But I don't think we're out of hope completely. And I'll say this. There are realists. There are realists. There was, for example, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is now the German president, who's not saying very much. It's a symbolic position. Back in 2016, when there was a 30,000 NATO troop exercise marching through Poland, at the same time, divisions were being sent to the Baltic states, right on the border with Russia, NATO divisions. He said it's not that we should not be saber rattling with Russia, that anybody who thinks that a tank parade on the border is a good idea is out of their minds, that we need to speak with Russia. And Peter Pavel, who is now the president-elect of the Czech Republic, who was a NATO commander at the time, said that we're not developing a defense barrier against Russia because there's no intelligence showing that Russia is any threat to Ukraine. This was in 2016. Russiagate was amping up. And at that time, there were these realist views that Russia's not a threat to the West. And this entire exercise that people forgot about now, 30,000 troops, Russia hasn't forgotten about that. So these people, these kinds of realist thinking, and I have to put Macron and Schultz in that camp, although they're extremely weak, especially Schultz, they have to win this battle. They have to argue their case behind closed doors. And it's leaked to the Wall Street Journal that they've told Zelensky he can't win. They got to settle. So they're starting to leak this now. And when we hear this coming out of realists in the U.S., if there are any, and there seem to be some, at least in the Pentagon, that get Biden's ear and tell him you cannot do this any further, that we got to find a face-saving way out of this because we bit off way too much here and we're threatening the future of civilization. So we have to hope that the realists, and in Europe as well, can win out over these fanatics, really. And there are too many of them.
Well, I'm not very optimistic in that respect, because Jeremy, everything that Joe says is absolutely right. But I mean, the tendency, this is ideologically driven. I keep saying, what about peace and security? These people don't talk in those terms. It's a different idiom for them. Jeremy, the argument that I keep hearing from these people in Washington and London is that, no, we have to focus our energy on China, not Russia. So it's the same mindset, okay? Unfortunately, because of the way they're doing things, they're confronting both at the same time. So as I started out, great powers usually avoid going toe-to-toe with great powers. Now the U.S. is going toe-to-toe with two great powers. Jeremy.
Well, yeah, it gets to what I was saying before, of just completely self-destructive behavior. Chris Hedges gave a very powerful speech at the Rage Against the War Machine rally, and he just talked about this world of illusions that these neocons live in, the intellectual dishonesty, the unwillingness to see things realistically at all. And I think they live in a kind of bubble. They're not in tune with regular people, certainly not in Russia or that region of the world. So it's a very dangerous situation when you have this breed of, as you put it, kind of fanatics. We've already seen the havoc they've wreaked in the Middle East, their attempt to overthrow government after government. So, I mean, the American government really has been hijacked by these extremists. And, it's a threat to humanity at this point. And, it's unbelievable to be provoking China and Russia at the same time, at a time when the U.S. economy is weakening and when China and these countries are becoming ever more stronger.
Pi, give us the economics of it here. I mean, you've been on the program many times since the start of the military operation in Ukraine, and I've never really been able to comprehend why Europe is willing to go down this path. Behind closed doors, you have Schultz, you have Macron, you have to make tough choices. I think that's what they said to Zelensky here. But what about the tough choices for themselves? Go ahead, Pi.
I mean, all of this, we can use all the labels until the cows come home. Neocon, neoliberal, mandarins, whatever. It begs the question over who runs things genuinely and how they run things. All of this misdirection, all of this, false flagging is a testament to the sense that those that run things prefer to obviously stay behind the scenes, draw up multi-billionaires to act in their stead. Very, very old money drawing back centuries. and working on a new world order that's been centuries in the making, and yet is very highly over leveraged to the tune of hundreds of trillions of dollars. And here they are having the playbook being flipped on them by the building Eurasian alliance that is tying its monetary system to hard asset commodities, be it gold, physical gold and silver and other precious metals, minerals, obviously oil and natural gas. When you do that, you're basically calling the bluff. And not just since, Nixon took us off the gold standard 52 years ago, or even Bretton Woods, but really begging the question over what the meaning of a numeraire or of money should be. And none of this can be obviously put out in the open because it would, quote unquote, affect confidence within markets, indices, everything. And hence, you just have to keep, as the West and as those that are tasked with diplomacy or lack thereof, the crazy man, this Nixonian concept of just, act like you're completely nuts in order to have the other side capitulate or, demur. And, the playbook is completely open to Russia and China in every way imaginable, and they keep calling bluffs. And so it comes down to, what are you going to do? I mean, yes, you're going to need to sacrifice all of Europe practically in order to salvage your already over leveraged economic system, which there's no end in sight over how you're going to continue to destroy the earth and decimate the meaning of hard asset money in order to, have very, very powerful nuclear armed and tightly allied Eurasian countries that have, as your other guests mentioned, the loyalty of the rest of the world practically at this point capitulating. And it's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Joe, we've had a number of times what I call peak Zelensky, when people wearing pins on their lapels and flags and all of that. But don't the people that are claim to be backing Ukraine or have sympathy for it, don't they understand that the policies that the West has promoted is actually destroying Ukraine? I mean, what is going to be left of Ukraine when this is all said and done? I'm not very optimistic there'll be much left. Joe?
Well, if they try to figure out and understand what's really happening here, they're going to stop with this blind loyalty towards the U.S. and European message about this all being an unprovoked invasion. And they have to start to understand some of the context for how this happened. Otherwise, we won't be able to get out of it, except with statesmanship. And this is, I agree with you, Peter. It's hard to be optimistic at all. But if you look back, Eisenhower stopped, Curtis LeMay wanted to drop 300 atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs on Russia, on the Soviet Union. And then there was the missile crisis. And Kennedy worked it out by removing his missiles from Turkey. And even though he...
But Joe, that's why
we need that today.
That's why I mentioned the post-war period, because Biden is an anomaly. You're right. These past presidents, and maybe it's because of ego and legacy, but, taking a line from Dr. Strangelove, I don't want to be the greatest mass murderer since Adolf Hitler, okay? Every single president had that mantra except for Biden, Joe.
He's a warmonger. He's been that way. I mean, the Iraq War is his war as much as anyone else's, the 2003 invasion. He saw in 1997, as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he said, if we expand NATO, it's going to create a hostile reaction from Russia. And he seemed to be okay with that. Now he's got his hostile reaction, and he happens to be sitting in the White House. The guy is not all there mentally, let's face it. So that's another thing we have to factor in here. It's extremely dangerous to have a man in his mental condition in this situation right now. So again, I'm not that optimistic. I'm saying that the realists have to grab control here and stop this. And I don't know. And Ukraine, as far as your question, is going to be destroyed. Every day it's getting destroyed more and more. They're using the Ukrainians. And as your guest earlier said, why aren't the Ukrainian people waking up and realize what pawns they're being used as? They don't. Because for them, it's a local issue. They don't like Russia. They think Russia is just attacking them. And they don't understand the geopolitical game going on here. A lot of Ukrainians, I think. So, yes, their country is being destroyed on the altar of American incredible ambition and hegemony. And I think there's got to be this turning point where this stops. But how do they climb down from this? This is really where the question lies.
Jeremy,
no head of state is in charge. No head of state is in charge of anything transatlantically, not even those that they've deployed like Newland or otherwise. We really need to get to the bottom of who is actually calling the shots. Let's start with square one.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll say to all three of you and then go to Jeremy. I think we're in the most dangerous point in this conflict right now because everything the West has done is backfired or failed. It doesn't have the world behind them. Jeremy, I'm really worried about a false flag, chemical, biological, nuclear false flag event. That's what I'm most worried about. 40 seconds before we go. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I think we've seen plenty of false flags already during this conflict. We've seen, false atrocity fabrication like in Bucha. So I think that's going to continue. And yeah, I mean, there's the precedent with the Assad, chemical weapon attack. We could very easily see something like that as a pretext for further escalation. And I think, as far as who's running this, we have to look at the military-industrial complex and these, companies that have made huge profits off this. Like Raytheon, they basically control the Pentagon with Lloyd Austin. So I think, these politicians are mere figureheads. And yeah, Biden shifted throughout his career. He was, he was involved in some of the arms agreements, I believe, when he was in, back in the 80s. And he had a more dovish posture.
Well, don't forget, Joe Biden's involved in the destruction of the former Yugoslavia. He played a key role in that as well. All right, gentlemen, I got to jump in here. We've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. I want to thank my guests in Tulsa, Los Angeles, and in Sydney, and I want to thank my viewers for watching us.